we'll start. Etymology of English. And this is from, it's etymology.com. English, people of England, the speech of England, Old English, contrasted to Danish, Frenish, etc., from Engel, plural, the Angles, the name of the Germanic groups that overran the island in the 5th century, supposedly so called because Angel, the land they inhabited on the Jutland coast was shaped like a fishhook. The term was used from the earliest times without distinction from all the Germanic invaders, Angles, Saxons and Jutes, and that's from Bede's Gens Anglorum, and applied to their group of related languages by Alfred the Great. After 1066, the population of England, as distinguished from Normans and French, a distinction which lasted only about a generation. The etymology of Albion. Albion, ancient name of England, Old English, from Latin, sometimes said to be from the non-Indo-European base alb, meaning mountain, allegedly, which also is suggested as the source of Latin Alps, Albania and Alba, an Irish name for Scotland, but more likely from Latin albus, meaning white, see alb, which would be an apt description of the chalk cliffs of the island's southern coast, again from the same source. Etymology of Britain, 1300, allegedly. Bretagne, from Old French Bretagne, and my pronunciation is appalling, so please forgive me. From Latin Britannia, earlier Britannia, from Brittany, the Britons, see Britain. The Old English place name Britonland meant Wales. If there was a Celtic name for the island, it has not been recorded. Oh, really? Alleged kings and queens and kings of England, 757 to 1087. From 757 to 796, Offa, House of Mercia. 802 to 839, Egbert, House of Wessex. The next one, Athelwulf, House of Wessex. Athelbold, House of Wessex. Athelbert, House of Wessex. Athelred, House of Wessex. Alfred the Great, House of Wessex. Edward the Elder, House of Wessex. Athelstan, House of Wessex. Edmund, House of Wessex, and that takes us up to 946. Then Edward, House of Wessex. Edwy, House of Wessex. Edgar, House of Wessex. Edward the Martyr, House of Wessex. Ethelred the Unready, House of Wessex. Edmund Ironside, not in a chair, I don't think, House of Wessex. King Canute, no, you have to get that right, it's very easy not to. King Canute, House of Denmark. And this takes us up to 1035. At 1035 to 1040, Harold I Harefoot, House of Denmark. 1040 to 1042, Arthur Canute, House of Denmark. 1042 to 1066, critical year, Edward the Confessor. 1066, same year, Harold II, back to the House of Wessex. And 1066 to 1087, William the Bastard, the House of Norman. And that was his real name. He called himself that. Everybody called himself that. But if it had been taught in schools, or rather the prison camps where they program our children to be compliant robots and psychopaths, if they taught them that, if they taught us all that, we would have had a completely different idea of exactly what happened in 1066. William the Bastard, on his deathbed after falling from a horse, he made an act of contrition. He apologized to all present at his death for the genocide that had been perpetrated and sponsored by the Church of Rome to wipe out all of the indigenous peoples on these lands who had any knowledge or recollection of the real past, which had all but been destroyed. But thankfully, quite a bit of it survived. Historia Ecclesiastica, Gentis Anglorum, by the Venerable Bede. This is one of the most quoted historical documents, and it's one of the oldest. He lived from 673 to 735, and he lived over the Tyne from where I am currently based, in Jarrow. Quote, Britain, an island in the ocean, formerly called Albion, is situated between the north and west, facing, though at a considerable distance, the coasts of Germany, France and Spain, which form the greatest part of Europe. This island at present, following the number of the books in which the divine laws was written, he's talking about the ecclesiastical histories written by the Church of Rome, well, it contains 5 nations: the English, the Britons, notice the distinction, Scots, Picts, and Latins, each in its own particular dialect, cultivating the sublime study of the divine truth. The Latin tongue is, by the study of the scriptures, become more common to all the rest. At first, this island had no other inhabitants but the Britons, from whom it derived its name, and who, coming over into Britain, as is reported, from Amorica, that's Brittany, possessed themselves of the southern parts thereof. And the source is the new version of Free the Planet, selfrealization.com. Although obviously it wasn't posted there first. Okay, this is the Historia Britonum by Nennius, circa the year 830, and this is a version translated by an Oxbridge historian and translator called J.A. Giles. Quote, "The island of Britain derives its name from Brutus, a Roman consul. Its inhabitants consist of 4 different people: the Scots, the Picts, the Saxons, and the ancient Britons." Where's the 5th gone? This is after Bede. It is fertilized by several rivers which traverse it in all directions, to the east and west, to the south and north, but there are 2 preeminently distinguished among the rest, the Thames and the Severn, which formerly, like the 2 arms of Britain, bore the ships employed in the conveyance of riches acquired by commerce. The Britons were once very populous and exercised extensive dominion from sea to sea. Now, before we just continue here. So this is prior to the 9th century. This is a revered history of Britain, and he's saying that through commerce, the Britons, they brought in untold wealth in commerce. Well, weren't we told at school that we were just a bunch of savages who were civilized by the Anglo-Saxons? And we had no laws, no equity, no justice. It was just a free-for-all. Oh, I certainly was. This is the Irish version of Historia Britonum. Quote, "I have taken pains to write certain fragments, and I am Nenamnis," it's another version of Nennius, "a disciple of Eulodarch, because the folly of the ignorance of the nation of Britannia have given to oblivion the history and origin of its first people, so that they are not commemorated in writings nor in books. But I have brought together the histories that I found in the annals of Rome, out of the chronicles of the learned saints, vis-a-vis Isidora, Jerome, and Eusebius, in the annals of the Saxons and the Gaels, and what I discovered from the tradition of our own old men. Numerous are its cares or cities, innumerable its raths or forts and its fortified castles. 4 races inhabit the island of Britain: the Gaels, the Cruithnac Picts, the Britons, and the Saxons. Again, the Latins are missed out. The Britons at first filled the whole island with their children, from the Sea of Icht to the Sea of Orc, both with glory and excellency." Now this document, this is one of the most suppressed documents of all time, the Brut Tissilo, also known as the Chronicle of England, or the Chronicle of Britain, or the Britons. And this again, it's a translation from an Oxford historian, and as we go on, you'll see the plethora of deceptions or omissions or mistakes, depending on which way you want to look at it. Quote, "Britain, the best of the islands, which used to be called Albion, the White Island, situated as it is in the Western Ocean between Frank and Eredon," that's France and Ireland, "extends 800 miles in its length and 200 in its width, and whatever men must needs use, it supplies them in unfailing plenty. And with this, it is full of numerous wide-spreading plains and noble hills and havens to which, from overseas, come foreign products in great variety. And there are also in it forests and thickets full of various kinds of animals and wild beasts, and many swarms of bees gathering honey among the flowers. There are with this fair pastures at the front of the windswept mountains, and bright clear springs. And further, there are lakes and rivers full of various varieties of fish. And so it is peopled by 5 nations: the Britanniat, the Normandiad, the Saxons, Saxons, and the Picts. That's the Picts. And the Isagotide. And it escapes me at the moment, but it's the one that I mentioned before, the race. And all of these, there's a B missing there. And all of these, the Britanniad were the first to settle it, from Morid, the Channel, as far as the Sea of Eredon, the Irish Sea, until the vengeance of God came upon them for their sins. Well, it's another monk talking. But again, there's another story attached to that, which is all part of a different seminar. And I may touch on it later in the Q&A because some serious shit's gone down on these islands. Okay, so now we come to the triads of the Isle of Prydain. Can you remember any of those historians talking about Prydain? No. And these triads, they predate all of those historical works, because these are the triads of the bards, who were supposedly the Welsh bards, but they were really the Britons, the British bards. The bards were the conveyors of the knowledge and the wisdom that was handed down from generation to generation when things were not committed to paper for fear that people would lose the memory of them. But they were committed to paper during the so-called dark period when the knowledge began to be lost and there were various catastrophes which destroyed the ancient knowledge, or the people who were carrying it. 1. There were 3 names given to the Isle of Prydain. Before it was inhabited, it was called the Seagirt Greenland. Later, it was called the Honey Island. The people formed a tribe called the Cymry on the Isle of Prydain after Prydain ap Aed the Great. And no one has any right to it but the tribe of the Cymry, for they first took possession, and before this time there were no persons living on it, but it was full of bears, wolves, crocodiles, and bison. Talking about the Welsh there. Probably the most ridiculed and oppressed nation on these shores in recent times. And this is because the key to the history of these lands lies in the history of the Cambrians, as they were formerly known, the Welsh, the Cymry. Okay. 2. There were 3 primary divisions of the Isle of Prydain: Cymru, Lugria, and ALBIEN. Sound like Albion? The rank of sovereignty belongs to each of the 3 under a monarchy and voice of the country. They are governed according to the regulations of Prydain, and to the nation of the Cymry belongs the right of establishing the monarchy by the voice of the country and the people, according to rank and primeval right under the protection of such regulation. Royalty ought to exist in every country in the Isle of Prydain, and every royalty ought to be under the protection of the voice of the country. Therefore it is said, the country is more powerful than the Lord. 3. There are 3 pillars of the social state in the Isle of Prydain. They are the voice of the country, royalty, and judicature, according to the regulation of Prydain. 4. There are 3 pillars of the nation of the Isle of Prydain. The first was Hugh the Mighty, who brought the nation of the Cymry first to the island of Prydain. And they came from the summer country, which is also called Defrabani, the summer land, or Atlantia. And they came over the hazy sea to the Isle of Prydain, where they settled. The second was Prydain, who first organized a social state of sovereignty in the land of Prydain. For before that time there was no justice but what was done by favour, nor any law except that of superior force. The third was, and this guy is probably the most amazing of all the hidden British kings. The third was Dyfnwal Moelmud. That's Daniel the Bold, translated in modern language. For he first made arrangements respecting the laws, maxims, customs, and privileges of the country and the tribe, and by these reasons they were called the 3 pillars of the nation of the Cymry. 5. There were 3 social tribes of the Isle of Prydain. The first was the tribe of the Cymry, who came to the Isle of Prydain with Hugh the Mighty because he would not possess a country and lands by fighting and pursuit, but by justice and tranquility. The second was a tribe of Lugrians, who came from Gascony, and they were descended from the tribe of the Cymry. The third were the Brythons, who came from Amorica, and were descended from the tribe of the Cymry. These were called the 3 peaceful tribes because they came by mutual consent and tranquility. And these tribes were descended from the primitive tribe of the Cymry, and all 3 tribes had the same speech. This was one nation with many different clans and 3 different sovereignties, all coexisting without war, without conquest, and without tyranny. 6. There were 3 refuge-seeking tribes that came to the island of Prydain, and they came under the peace and permission of the tribe of the Cymry, without arms and without opposition. The first was a tribe of Caledonians in the north. The second was the Irish tribe, who dwelled in the highlands of Scotland. The third were the people of Galeden, who came in naked, that's Holland, the Low Countries, who came in naked vessels to the Isle of Wight when their country was drowned, when they had land granted, where they had land granted to them by the tribe of the Cymry. They had no privilege of claim in the island of Prydain, but they had land and protection assigned to them under certain limitations. And it was stipulated that they should not possess the rank of native Cymry until the 9th of their lineal descendants. 9 generations down, they became natives of Britain. 7. There were 3 invading tribes that came to the island of Prydain and who never departed from it. The first were the Coranians, who came from the country of Powell. The second were the Irish Picts, who came to ALBIEN by the North Sea. The third were the Saxons. The Coranians were settled about the river Humber and the shore of the German Ocean. The Irish Picts are in ALBIEN about the shore of the Sea of Denmark. The Coranians and the Saxons united, and by violence and conquest brought the Lugrians into confederacy with them, and subsequently took the crown of the monarchy from the tribe of the Cymry. I think one of my favourites is about to come up and you'll see why. No, it's not this one. There remained none of the Lugrians that did not oh, it is this one, sorry. There remained none of the Lugrians that did not become Saxons, except those that are found in Cornwall and the Commot of Canaban in Dara and Bernicia in this period. In this manner, the benevolent tribe of the Cymry, who preserved both their country and their language, lost the sovereignty of the island of Prydain on account of the treachery of the refuge-seeking tribes and the pillage of the 3 invading tribes. What this means is, Michael of Bernicia, I chose that because that's where I was born. That's where I currently live. It's where I've lived for large parts of my life. I'm a Geordie by another word, but I'm a Bernician in ancient terms. And the Bernicians, or rather the inhabitants of Dara and Bernicia, were the only ones who did not succumb to the conquest of the Saxons. The only ones in the territory of Lugria. Okay? History of Britain from the Flood to AD 700. Compiled by the various ancient records by Richard Williams Morgan. Has anyone heard of this work? Well, neither had I until Michael of Elmet, who's not here yet, found it on the internet last year. And it's an amazing work. It's, again, one of the most suppressed works of all time. Okay. Quote, the notions so sedulously inculcated, first by the pagan, then by papal Rome, that all nations except the 2 occupying the little peninsulas of Greece and Italy were barbarians, may be now classed among the obsolete impositions on medieval credulity. It must at the same time be conceded that the Roman polity did not commence with the first Latin authors, whose date is barely a century before Julius Caesar, that would be 54 BC around about, and that the refinement of the prehistoric age, which could produce an Iliad, was something very wide indeed from a myth. Everything we've been taught as a myth was based on what happened. It was based on the Bard's triads. The Trojan descent of the Britons has been assigned the place to which it is substantially entitled in this history. It solves the numerous and very peculiar agreements in the social and military systems of prehistoric Britain and Asia, which would otherwise remain inexplicable. It has always been consistently maintained by native authorities, and by extending the circle of researchers, it is found to receive ample and unexpected confirmations from the earliest documents of Italy, Gaul, Britannia, Spain, and even Iceland. It's at this point that I should say that, to my great surprise, and yet it made perfect sense, who is Prydain? Where did the name come from? Obviously you can see Prydain, Britain, it has a similar sound, you can see how it would change over the years, but who was Prydain? On equally solid grounds of evidence, the social state of Britain has been described as from its first settlement by Hugh the Mighty, again this is confirming what we've already read in the more ancient texts, that of a civilized and polished community, had no other monument of Cymric antiquity but the code of British laws of Mulmitius, he says BC 600, but it was actually BC 400, around about then, which still forms the basis of our common or unwritten law, descended to us. We could not doubt that we were handling the index of a civilization of a very high order. In such a code, we possess not only the most splendid relic of pre-Roman Europe, but the key to all our British, as contradistinguished from continental institutions. After perusing it, we stand amazed at the blindness which wanders groping for the origin of British rights and liberties in the swamps of the motherland of feudal serfdom, Germany. Okay, so you haven't missed all of it, but quite a bit. So we'll catch up in a bit. Okay, so what we've just been through, for the lads who've just come in, what we've just been through is the basic... No, I really can't re-explain. I'll tell you later. Okay, but again, the source, you can get all of this on the Our Story section at selfrealization.com. Okay, so we come back to the Bruticelo, the much suppressed ancient history. Quote, "And the kingdom was rent into 5 parts, each part under its own king, which kings continually fought one another. After many years there arose a famous youth named Dunvalo Malmitius. He was the son of Cloten, a petty king of Cornwall, and his beauty and courage outshone that of all the kings of Britain. And he restored the land to its ancient dignity, and compiled laws which are known to this day as the laws of Dunvalo Malmitius, which even the Saxons obey. And he granted right of sanctuary to temples and to cities, and even to certain roads defined by law, so that any man who fled to them, whatever wrong he had done, should find sanctuary there unimpeded and without license from his foes." End quote. So that's from the Ticelo. Now this is an essay by, a guy who had connections with Oxbridge, but he certainly wasn't an establishment man, and you'll get that from this quote. This is from his book called Neglected British History. His name's Flinders Petrie. Quote, "The condition of pagan Britain is remarkably preserved in the laws of Dyfnwal Moelmud. That these laws are certainly long before the 10th century is proved by the gulf that exists between the state of society shown by them and that of the laws of Howell," that's Howell the Good in the 9th century or 10th century, "fixed to AD 914. The laws of Howell refer back to Moelmud. What takes the laws of Moelmud at least to Roman times is that they are purely pagan," he means Druidic. "How much farther back those laws may date, towards the traditional time of Moelmud, the 4th or 7th century BC, we cannot now inquire. That's because of how much history has been erased. The whole air is that of simple conditions and a free life, with much personal cultivation and sympathy and general conduct. It would be impossible to produce such a code from a savage or violent people, and this intimate view of their life is the best ground for judging of their qualities." Okay, this is a Stuart's historian, so an establishment historian we're talking about here. Percy Enderby says in his history published in 1661 that Malmitius, quote, "took upon himself the government of Brittany, i.e. Britain, in the year of the world's creation 4748, end quote. Meanwhile, the Tudor historian Holinshed reported in the 1587 edition of the Chronicles that Malmitius, quote, "began his reign over the whole monarchy of Britain in the year of the world 3529. That's 439 BC in the current calendar. Both authors agree with Ticelo on the reign's duration of 40 years. Given that the foundation of Rome was in 753 BC, Malmitius's reign was 439 to 399 BC. This is right for Malmitius's son Brennus to be the enemy commander at the sack of Rome in 390 BC and to be named as such by the Roman historian Livy. I haven't found that source yet, but everything that I'm presenting backs all of this up, everything. So what we're talking, let's just recap here. We're talking about the sack of Rome by the son of Malmitius, the ancient creator of the British common law system, which still, though hidden from view, exists today. It's never been repealed. It couldn't be repealed because it requires a convention of the people. It cannot be repealed by any so-called government, especially a government of usurpers, pirates, and genocidal maniacs. Right. That's quite unusual for me, I would say. Right. The Ancient Laws of Cambria, William Probart, circa 1823. Quote, "These triads are remarkably curious and interesting. They throw great light upon the manners and customs of the old Britons, and in many cases breathe a spirit of freedom that would not disgrace the polish of the 19th century. These triads also merit attention on account of their antiquity. They were framed by Dyfnwal Moelmud, who flourished about 400 years before the Christian era, and consequently are upwards of 2,000 years old." End quote. Now, before I come to the Mamertine laws, I'm just going to come back to that question of why were these islands named Britain but originally Prydain? Prydain. Why were they named that? Who was Prydain? Who was he? Can anyone guess? Or does anyone know? No. That would have been too extreme even for me. But Brutus. He was Brutus. So you've got the Welsh calling him Prydain. That was the Welsh name for Brutus. It was the Welsh name for Brutus. And you've got others saying that Brutus founded this country or this territory, the sovereignty in these lands, even the laws. And it is difficult to go through in this particular seminar because there is an awful lot of stuff I could go through proving that the Trojan Wars happened around about the 1200 years BC, and there was a great catastrophe around about that time which rendered these shores uninhabitable, which meant that when Brutus 100 years later came to these shores, it was relatively unpopulated. There was nobody here. There certainly wasn't any social state anymore, if there was before. But again, that's a different seminar. So Brutus founded the territory of Britain, or the sovereignty of Britain, and it would be 700 years later, the laws that were passed down by the bards were codified by the Mamertine laws, Dyfnwal Moelmud. So we're going to go through just a few of them now, because this will give you an idea. We're talking 400 or 600, depending on who you agree with, BC. There are 3 tests of civil liberty. Equality of rights, equality of taxation, freedom to come and go. There are 3 causes which ruin a state: inordinate privileges, corruption of justice, and national apathy. Ring any bells? There are 3 things which cannot be considered solid longer than their foundations are solid: peace, property, and law. 3 things are indispensable to a true union of nations: sameness of laws, rights, and language. There are 3 things free to all Britons, get ready: the forest, the unworked mine, the right of hunting wild creatures. There are 3 things which are private and sacred property in every man, Briton or foreigner: his wife, his children, his domestic chattels. Now, property, this actually means a man was responsible. The women and children weren't the man's property. This was just a means within the legal system that a man would be responsible for the behavior of his family, which is quite harsh on the man, as opposed to the other way around. You see what I mean? And this was agreed upon because everybody had a vote. The women had a vote as well. This is what they wanted. They understood the natural bond between the mother and children, and that taking away the child from a mother is a traumatic event to the child in the early years of development. And we've all been forced into a position where at least one of every set of parents, usually both these days, has to go to work and give our children into the care of the state. I'll just leave that hanging in the air there because we already know that that's not a good thing. Okay, there are 3 things belonging to a man which no law... All right, we've already done that, haven't we? No, it's the next one, yeah. There are 3 things belonging to a man which no law of men can touch, fine, or transfer: his wife, his children, and the instruments of his calling. For no man can unman a man or uncall a calling. Now let's just leave that hanging. Unman a man or woman or uncall a calling. What have they tried to do to men and women? What have they done? They've unmanned us. They've taken away, or rather they've brainwashed us into believing that all the things that we should be doing, we shouldn't be doing. That we should just comply, that we should seek to fit in, instead of resisting tyranny whenever we come face to face with it, because that, believe it or not, is exactly what the British tribes and British nations were known throughout the world for doing. There are 3 persons. Is that a legal fiction? Is it? No. They're talking about men and women. They're not talking about a legal fiction. There are 3 persons in a family exempted from all manual or menial work: the little child, the old man or woman, and the family instructor, the tutor, the educator, the real educator. There are 3 orders against whom no weapon can be bared: the herald, the bard, and the head of a clan. There are 3 of private rank against whom no weapon can be bared: a woman, a child under 15, and an unarmed man. There are 3 things that require the unanimous vote of the nation to effect. This really is my favourite: the deposition of the sovereign, the introduction of novelties in religion, and suspension of law. I just want to say the words deposition of the sovereign again, because I really like saying them. There are 3 civil birthrights of every Briton: the right to go wherever he pleases, the right wherever he is to protection from his land and sovereign, the right of equal privileges and equal restrictions. There are 3 property birthrights of every Briton: 5 British acres of land for a home, the right of armorial bearings, the right to carry arms, the right of suffrage, which is voting, in the enacting of the laws, the male at 21, the female on her marriage. So the women, generally married before 21, had a vote before the men. There are 3 guarantees of society: security for life and limb, security for property, security of the rights of nature. There are 3 sons of captives who free themselves: a bard, a scholar, a mechanic. There are 3 things the safety of which depends on that of the others: the sovereignty, national courage, and just administration of the laws. There are 3 things which every Briton may legally be compelled to attend: the worship of God, military service, and the courts of law. For 3 things a Briton is pronounced a traitor and forfeits his rights: emigration, collusion with an enemy, and surrendering himself and living under an enemy. There are 3 things free to every man, Briton, or foreigner, the refusal of which no law will justify: water from a spring, river, or well, firing from a decayed tree, a block of stone not in use. There are 3 orders who are exempt from bearing arms: the bard, the judge, the graduate in law or religion. These represent God and his peace, and no weapon must ever be found in their hand. There are 3 kinds of sonship: a son by marriage with a native Briton, an illegitimate son acknowledged on oath by his father, and a son adopted out of the clan. But that goes for daughters as well. There are 3 whose power is kingly in law: the sovereign paramount of Britain over all Britain and its isles, the princes palatine in their princedoms, and the heads of the clans in their clans. 3 are the thieves who shall not suffer punishment: a woman compelled by her husband, a child, a necessitous person who has gone through 3 towns and 9 houses in each town without being able to obtain charity though he asked for it. There are 3 ends of law: prevention of wrong, punishment for wrongs inflicted, and insurance of just retribution. There are 3 lawful castigations: of a son by a father, of a kinsman by the head of a clan, of a soldier by his officer. The chief of a clan, when marshalling his men, may strike his man 3 ways: with his baton, with the flat of his sword, with his open hand. Each of these is a correction, not an insult. There are 3 sacred things by which the conscience binds itself to truth: the name of God, the rod of him who offers up prayers to God, the joined right hand. There are 3 persons who have a right to public maintenance: the old, the babe, the foreigner who cannot speak the British tongue. I want to just recap on what we've gone over, and there may be a short period where you can ask any questions if you want. What we're talking about here, we're certainly not talking about a set of laws which could all be applied today fairly, equitably, or justly. But many of them could be. And many of them still form the basis of the common law, the unwritten common law. Now, I didn't have time to dig out the original sources, but I know for a fact, because I've read them, I couldn't grab the PDF in time to get the quotes. But William Blackstone acknowledged that the origin of the common law is the laws of Mulmud. And Sir William Coke acknowledged that the origins of the common law was the laws of Mulmud. And Lord Fortescue acknowledged that the Mulmutine laws were the basis of the so-called unwritten common law. Now, all of the research that I've done has also unearthed that Alfred the Great, the so-called Anglo-Saxon lawmaker, he incorporated the Mamertine laws into the Saxon laws before all of the indigenous tribes of Britain, as opposed to the invading tribes, had been wiped out. He incorporated it into the Saxon system, which was an entirely feudal system. The Anglo-Saxons, the German tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes were known for three things: piracy, genocide, and the fact that they had absolutely no kind of civilized culture whatsoever. So what did the Anglo-Saxons do when they found a civilized culture that did not have the same feudal hierarchy that they had? Because they had kings, and their word, if they were in a bad mood, they could kill someone. There didn't have to be a law that said they could. They just did it on a whim. They wiped out millions of people across the world, across the European continent, over centuries, probably a millennia. However, what they did was they created a hierarchy which didn't exist, because the one thing that the triads, or at least the elements of the triads that we've been over, the one thing that it doesn't convey, but again, I have sources which demonstrate that this is the case, there was no social hierarchy. There were only roles, rights, and responsibilities. In other words, Malmud, who created the laws, had no more rights except within his role as sovereign paramount, which we'll come to in a second, than any other man or woman. In other words, let's just say you had a beef with the king. You could ask the king for a duel. You wouldn't be killed. You wouldn't be executed. If you had a genuine gripe, it would go before an arbitrator or a judge, and they would weigh up the facts as they were presented and decide whether or not you had a genuine grudge and whether or not the king should face you in a duel. But this didn't often happen, because generally the kings who wronged the people were removed. Because remember, it said in the Mamertine laws, it says that the people, the voice of the country, was above the king or the queen, above any despotic ruler at any time before the Saxon genocide. Anybody could be deposed by a simple process. That process was, so an aggrieved party went to the head of his clan and said, I've got this grievance. I think we should secede, or we should form our own sovereign nation outside of this despot. They held a vote in their clan, and that was it. They were outside. It had to be accepted. Now, that didn't mean that whoever they had the grudge against or the dispute with, that didn't mean that they couldn't wage war against them, and they very often did. There have been endless civil wars, but Mahmud, he put an end to them. And the reason he did it is because he created a much fairer system than had ever existed before. And he confirmed that everybody had the same rights. Everybody was born with these unalienable rights. Now, why is it, do you think, that they've been able to get away with erasing so much of this from view? Why is it? Because who said that? Exactly, because we've let them. And how, or rather, what was the method by which they coerced us into letting them do it? Fearful?
Disconnection between the land and its natural law.
Exactly, because the most critical one. Let's look at it this way. Which is the only species on this planet that has to pay for its very existence on it? Us. Who's free? Who's free? Is there any one of us in this room who isn't 6 weeks away from getting evicted by pirates? I don't think so. I'm including myself. And I'm completely outside of their system. But if they made a claim against me and their corrupt system decided it was going to be enforced, I would have the bailiffs coming round and chucking my family on the streets just like everybody else. The reason they're not doing it is because I've put up a defensive force which they don't want to take on. And the reason they don't want to take it on is because I've declared a new social state into existence. And that's what we're going to talk about in the second section. And that social state is universal community trust. And it isn't just me. But it's founded upon the ancient laws of Molmud. It's founded upon that. These laws were never repealed. They were only obscured and obliterated by conquest and deception. Under international law and the law of nations since 1922 in something called the Kellogg Pact, war and conquest has been unlawful. Nothing can be taken by conquest. Nothing. And of course, they've continued with gay abandon, haven't they? They didn't stop them, but they've created the illusion that they are operating lawfully. And every intervention, it's a humanitarian intervention. We're only going into Syria to save the children by killing hundreds of thousands of people. And not just Syria, not just Libya. And of course, I'm sure many of you already know that what Gaddafi was doing, as opposed to wiping out his people, was granting them the back, because they've been taken from him, the unalienable rights that everybody has, greening the desert, giving away money so everyone could acquire their own home. It couldn't be taken away from them, giving them free energy. And he wrote it all down in a manifesto called the Green Book. How many of you have read it? There you go. He was also taking the continent of Africa out of the international monetary system. Well, he had to go, didn't he? He had to go. In their eyes. The eyes of the House of Rothschild. And just in case any of you aren't aware, it's provable. Again, selfrealization.com, just search for Rothschild and you'll get a load of documents which demonstrate beyond doubt that in 1815, Nathaniel Rothschild took control of world trade, the Bank of England, and the crowned heads of Europe and the Vatican, because they all were hocked up to their eyes, and there was a stock market crash that he created by walking into his usual spot in the stock exchange. Everyone turned to him because they knew he had control over the flow of information, and he would have word about whether Wellington or Napoleon had won the Battle of Waterloo. And he walks into the stock exchange ashen-faced, forlorn, and starts selling everything. Sell whatever price you get. Everybody else did the same. Secretly, while this is happening, he's got his minions buying up for a song everything. He took control of the East India Company, the East Africa Company, the Virginia Company, which was what America was effectively the Virginia Company. That's its origin. He took over all of world trade, and what he did was a deal with the crown heads of Europe. He said, look, we did a deal with the monarchy, the Anglo-Saxon monarchy of Britain, the usurpers, the line of usurpers from William the Bastard. He did a deal with them. And the deal was, I'll wipe out all of your debts, which you've got no hope of paying, because I've created an interest which doesn't exist in the financial system, so you've got absolutely no hope of paying it. I'll wipe it all out if you grant me royal breeding rights. Royal breeding rights. There's a researcher called Greg Hallett. Look up his name. You'll see it. He's had at least 11 attempts on his life of putting out this information. It's provable. Queen Victoria, the German, from the German family, the Saxe-Coburgs, or the Saxe-Coburg-Gothas, she was sired by Nathaniel Rothschild. Ever since Queen Victoria, the Rothschild has had an illegitimate child on the throne. Who was the first renowned English historian to miss out the bit about the laws of Molmud? Does anyone know? The first British historian, first so-called renowned British historian. Winston Rothschild. He was the illegitimate son of Jacob Rothschild. And again, this is provable. He also fathered Elizabeth, currently sitting on the ill-gotten throne. He fathered her. And the reason he fathered her is because during a very chaotic period for the monarchy in the 1930s or the 1920s or throughout that time, actually the whole of that part, at the early part of the 20th century, there'd been terrible feuding within that family. And what happened was there was one king who was incompetent, and there was another king who they thought was mad, and there was another one who they didn't know which way it would go. Would he turn into a tyrant, or would he be too benevolent? And the Queen Mother, the woman allegedly the mother of Elizabeth, her name escapes me at the moment. Say again? Bowes Lyon, Mary Bowes Lyon. She decided that she didn't want to be married to the king and basically nicked off to France, where she lived out her days. But in the early part of her life, because she was a naughty child apparently, and her governess was constantly scolding her, the minions went to Ireland and they pulled a child who looked exactly like her out, and they paid the family off, and she was called the whipping boy. And the whipping boy is the one who took the place of the real Queen Mother, and she was the maid. She was the maid of the royal court. But then she became the Queen Mother and gave birth through artificial insemination, the very first of its kind, by Winston Churchill. So there'd be another Rothschild on the throne, because there wasn't another alternative at the time. Say again?
You said Winston Churchill.
Winston Churchill was an illegitimate Rothschild. Now, what did Winston Churchill do? He waged war every chance he had. They built him up to be a hero. What about what he did to the German people? What about the slaughter? Was it Dresden? Where they carpet bombed when there was nothing, no military targets even worth taking out, just to destroy more people. And Churchill, being the first renowned historian, to not include in his history the laws of Mulmud. That to me is evidence, if Churchill was the illegitimate child of Rothschild, that the House of Rothschild has been systematically erasing all trace of the real unwritten common law of these lands. Now, that being the case, when you trace it back, you see, well, that's only what the Catholic Church was doing from the time that they sponsored the Norman genocide, and by the end of William the Bastard's reign, they'd wiped out all the indigenous tribes. There was nobody with this knowledge anymore. But secretly, the Druids fled to the Western Isles of Scotland and Ireland, and they hid, sometimes in caves, but they buried the knowledge. They buried the manuscripts. But their forebears, their forefathers, they'd recorded this on megaliths, and they're all around this country. There's something called the Gosby Stone. The Gosby Stone records the Great Catastrophe, which was, I believe, 1122 BC, around about a century before Brutus and the Trojans came here to settle. The Gosby Stone records the Great Catastrophe. And if you want to find out more about this subject, just do a search on William Cummins Beaumont. He wrote 4 books, and he was writing between the 20s or the 30s and the 1950s. Now, I'm sure quite a few of you have heard of Immanuel Velikovsky and his theory of the Great Catastrophe really causing the flood, that there are certain parts of the original scriptures, the Bible by another name before it was bastardized, that are historical records of the Great Catastrophe and the migrations. Now, everyone assumes that the people who settled here, they actually came from the south. They came from warmer climes to the north, or they came from the east. Well, they did. But the tribes that came from those parts, they originated here on these islands. And I'm winding up this hour by I'm encouraging you to go and research this subject, because Cummins Beaumont puts forward a thesis that all of the so-called biblical times chronicled in the scriptures took place on these shores prior to the Great Catastrophe. And then the tribes, because the land was underwater, those that weren't wiped out, they migrated until the land recovered. But it was he who was first back had first claim. And those who came back were those who descended from these shores, which is why that's the explanation of the 3 peaceful tribes of the Cymry coming and settling here again. It wasn't just random. It was, well, let's go and see what's over there. You know, let's check out this Western Isle. That sounds interesting.
Going back home.
Going back home. Otherwise, how could they have the same tongue? Has anyone got any questions about any of it? Yeah.
Is it the Colbrian language?
The Colbrian alphabet.
Yeah, alphabet.
The Colburn alphabet was that's another reason why the Welsh history has been obliterated, because the Colburn alphabet was the alphabet that created the original words on the megaliths and in the writings of the bards.
It was also used in America 3,000 years ago.
They were trading with America. They weren't warring with them or conquering them. They were trading.
They could speak Welsh, basically.
They could speak Welsh. Now here's another thing. Has everyone seen The Lord of the Rings?
Yeah.
Look at the writing in the manuscripts in the second part of Lord of the Rings. Look at the manuscripts and you'll see a strange form of lettering. Then do a search for pictures of the Colburn alphabet and you'll see that what Tolkien committed to paper in his sketches was the Colburn alphabet. And I believe, or I don't believe, I suspect from my researches that because, and this is definitely provable, there were 2 Oxbridge dons who had access to the secret libraries at Oxford, and one was Tolkien. Now Tolkien, my understanding of Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings is he was telling the story of the descent into darkness of the most civilized society which had decayed into utter evil and shadow, and that was the land of Atlantis. And the land of Atlantis stretched before the flood from the tip of Scandinavia, the tip of Norway, all the way down to the end of Britain. That was the land of Atlantis. And that's why Atlantis, that was the why Atlantis was referred to in the triads. That's why. Okay.
So that catastrophe, would that be like ice melting and sea levels rising?
It's provable through geological, archaeological, and some megalithic records. It's provable, and Commons Beaumont does this. And I was blown away when I read it, because I started off thinking, well, he's going to have to go a long way to convince me, first of all, that Edinburgh, the site of Edinburgh, is where ancient Jerusalem stood, and he does it. He proves it beyond belief. Beyond doubt, because the topography of ancient Jerusalem, as described in the scriptures, is exactly the same as Edinburgh, and the topology of the city of Jerusalem that we know now is nothing like it. Nothing at all. And he proves it in great detail. But he goes further back than that. Ancient Crete was Shetland before the flood. Shetland. Hermes is not a myth. Hermes was a king. He was a druid king, a magician. And they all started in the outer, they came down from what's now Scandinavia into the West Isles of Scotland, and they kept coming south. And that's how there was such an advanced druidic culture at a time 2,000 years before the Anglo-Saxons claimed that we were just a bunch of savages here on these islands. And the druidic culture on these islands was not the barbaric culture that we've been told it was. It followed the laws of Molmud. The Molmutine laws were the foundations of the druidic religion. I think because I've got so much to get through, I'll leave it there for the first section, unless there's any more questions.
What was the inspiration for the Molmutine laws? What would have inspired those?
It was the teachings of the bards and the druids, what was right and what was wrong.
Yeah.
Because we're told, oh no, everything's, the New Age woo-woo that we've been subjected to over the past 25 years, I'll come to you in a second, in various forms, has taught us to believe things, or to take things as truth that are complete falsehoods. And the idea that a culture that was where the Druids were the most respected people in the community, they were the ones who couldn't carry weapons as well. Well, why didn't the people wipe them out if they were tyrants? Why didn't they say, no, I'm not giving my child to sacrifice? Because they didn't sacrifice children. They sacrificed lambs, goats, I think there might have been one more animal. Nothing else, but mostly there was no kind of blood sacrifice. It was only special occasions when they did one of those did sacrifice any kind of animal and spilt the blood. However, they did everything with compassion and everything with love. And there was one slogan, which they didn't call it a slogan, but there was one line which summed up the entire culture in one word, the entire religion in one word. Sorry, not one word, one sentence. The truth against the world. In other words, it's not a battle between the truth and the world. It's weigh the truth up against the world. because the truth exists irrespective of what's in the world. Well, armed with that little piece of knowledge, a little child could have an amazing life where they just always ask questions. Well, what have they done to all the children who ask questions in school? They tell them to shut up. They say, don't do that. That's why, and I know it's difficult for many people to make this decision. That's why me and my wife made the decision that we would sacrifice one of us going out to try and earn whatever we could earn to make our lives easier, so that one of us could always be there for our daughter and she wouldn't have to go to school. She's not registered, she's never been vaccinated, and she never gets any letters from the state at all. We've had one visit from a health visitor, and that health visitor described us as the future of parenting, because we said, Serenity, that's her name, you go and answer the door. She was 2, and she opened the door, she said, hello Linda, come in and have a cup of tea. She's only 2, how? Well, we don't send her to school or nursery, and she's been with one of her parents every day. Now, I know I'm a father, I'm obviously biased, but this little girl is a force of nature because she hasn't been subjected to all the bullshit that's imposed upon most children in this country, in the world, and she never will be. And believe me, she's leading her own life, and she's freer than me because I had the system imposed upon me through the ignorance of my parents, like most of us. She hasn't. So I'll leave it there because that makes me happy and smile.